the first starting point as a group of, on the left, the Fabians, with their great traditions of progressive thinking, I think we have to recognize that the progressive side of politics has only really succeeded when it has a vision of a good society that's future-oriented, that is different from the past, and that has confronted the structural inequalities and insecurities generated by the existing form of capitalism. And I've written a book recently which came out and is getting me into more trouble, as you would expect, called The Corruption of Capitalism, which is essentially about how neoliberalism of the past 40 years or so, since Thatcher and Reagan launched it, has morphed into a system of rentier capitalism, where more and more of the income and wealth and power and status has gone to the owners of property, physical, financial, and intellectual property, and less has been going to those who rely on labor and work for their living standards. And that has gone along with an incredible increase in economic fragility. When the COVID pandemic struck, it was already the 6th pandemic of this century. And we've clearly been shown that we don't have a robustness, don't have a capacity of immunity to economic shocks, and we certainly don't have resilience. One thing we should have learned more than any other in the past year and a half out of this pandemic is that the resilience of all of us and the resilience of society depends on the resilience of the weakest members of society. And what we're learning is we're all part of the weakest members of society. We all lack resilience. And that is part of the background context of what I want to talk about on basic income. Because the argument for basic income is fundamentally ethical. And the left has always been best when it relies on its ethical foundations, not an instrumentalism, but a fundamentally ethical orientation. Before I come to that and the ethical issues, let me briefly pause to define what I mean by basic income. Basic income would mean that every individual, man, woman, and child, with child receiving a smaller amount, would receive a modest basic income as an economic right of being a legal resident citizen of Australia or wherever. It would be paid unconditionally in behavioral terms. In other words, you wouldn't be subject to a means test, a work test, or other tests, and it would be non-withdrawable. It would be a right. And part of it, it could be at any level. The level would have to be determined, and you would want to be moving towards a higher level, and you could claw back from the wealthy through adjusting the tax rate. Come to how to fund it if we have time later. But that definition means that it's not a capital grant, and it's not a means-tested social assistance of the type that's in Australia and Britain and elsewhere, but it's a right. And that leads to this ethical justification. The first justification is that it is a matter of common justice. As I've argued in my book, the right to subsistence stems from the Magna Carta and the Charter of the Forest of 1217, which asserted that everybody has a right to subsistence in the commons. And the commons are part of our society. The left has neglected the commons in recent decades, but the commons gives us our informal social protection and our means of survival. And we have been deprived of the commons by elites and powerful corporations and capital in general, but they belong to all of us. And the essence of common justice is to say that if we allow private inheritance of private wealth, which is a lot of something for a minority for doing nothing, we should allow for the public inheritance, a common dividend on the public wealth that has been generated by the many, many generations before us, including those groups that Andrew began by mentioning quite correctly. They are the commoners. We are all commoners. But we have been deprived of our commons, and in a sense, having a public dividend is a dividend on the public wealth created by the generations before us. And we don't know whose ancestors created more or less of the public wealth. It is part of common justice. It is also a matter of religious justice. If you're religious, and I'm very pleased that the Pope came out in favor of basic income last year. God, if you believe in God, God gave us unequal talents. And in a sense, a basic income would be a compensation for those without the talent of making money or being opportunistic or whatever it might be. It's also a matter of work justice. Our systems have been absolutely disgraceful in treating the most vital part of work as non-work, and that is care work. The essential work that has suddenly been rediscovered in the SO has been uncompensated by our systems of social protection. And this part of justice, I think, is very important. It's also a matter of ecological justice. The rich and powerful corporations are those who create the pollution. The poor are those who have to pay the price by living in areas that are highly polluted. So this first part of the rationale is important. The second ethical justification is it's a matter of giving people basic security. Basic security is a human need. It's also a public good. In other words, you having basic security doesn't deprive me of having it, and vice versa. And in fact, if we all have basic security, the value to all of us increases. And psychologists have taught us that people who do not have basic security lose mental bandwidth. Their IQ actually goes down, and their capacity to make rational decisions and be socially responsible is debilitated by insecurity. It's vital that we have security. Basic income would give people that modest basic security, not total security. It wouldn't remove the incentives to improve our lives, but it would give us basic security. The third ethical justification, and which is where the left has been pretty bad in the past century or more, is that it would enhance freedom. We all say we believe in freedom, but we don't create the institutional mechanisms that allow proper freedom for all. First, it would enhance libertarian freedom, the freedom to choose, the freedom to say no, the freedom to make choices in a market system. The second, and more important in some respects, because it would enhance liberal freedom. Liberal freedom is the freedom to be moral. And you can only be moral if you can make decisions without people telling you what you have to do. It is essentially anti-paternalistic. Basic income would say, you as a human being now have responsibility for making decisions, whereas a means-tested, behavior-tested system deprives people of liberal freedom. And third, and most importantly for those of us on the left, it would enhance Republican freedom. This is the freedom from potential domination. A woman is not free if she has to ask her husband or her father if she can do something, even if she knows that 99% of the time he would say yes. A woman is only free when she can make that decision regardless of what anybody else says. That's Republican freedom, the freedom to look the other person in the eye as an equal. These justifications are developed at greater length in my books, but I want to go quickly to the instrumental reasons why now not only is a basic income ethically imperative, but it is also economically imperative. I go back to William Beveridge, whose famous report in 1942 set the scene for the post-war welfare state capitalism. And in that famous report on page 2, he said, we need to move away from tinkering, and it is time for revolution, not patching. And it is time to confront 5 giants: disease, idleness, ignorance, squalor, and want. Today, we are at another transformational moment when we are confronted with 8 giants that are blocking the road to a good society. And this is the subject of a recent book that I did for John McDonnell when he was Shadow Chancellor. He asked me to prepare a report because had Labour been elected in Britain, we were going to introduce a pilot basic income. And he said, Guy, could you write up a justification and a design for how we would do those pilots? What I wrote, I've written as a book called Battling 8 Giants. Very briefly, let me just go through what those 8 giants are that are stopping us today. The first is inequality. We have grotesque inequality, and wealth inequality is much greater than income inequality, and wealth has risen relative to income, making the situation far worse than our conventional income statistics make it appear. And we need to reduce inequality because it is creating the worst forms of lack of robustness, lack of resilience. The second is insecurity. Now, whereas Beveridge was confronted by industrial society with a Keynesian economics of full employment, today we have a different situation where with a globalized economy, we are confronted by uncertainty, not contingency risks. Uncertainty means unknown unknowns. You cannot have social insurance, you cannot have an insurance system that deals with uncertainty because you don't know the probabilities and you don't know the probable consequences and the difficulties that will ensue. And that is the era in which we are living. So you have to have a different system to give people basic security. And a basic income wouldn't cure all uncertainty, but it would at least put a floor under it. The third giant is, of course, debt. One of the reasons why the world economy didn't recover quickly from COVID is that we were suffering from unprecedentedly high levels of public, corporate, and household debt, much greater than at the time of the Spanish flu. And debt, of course, means that people in the precariat are always living on the edge of unsustainable debt, where one shock, one accident, one illness will push people into a terrible abyss. And the third giant is linked to the fourth giant. We have a pandemic of stress. Stress is a major cause of rising morbidity. My own country, life expectancy has been going down before the pandemic hit because of stress-related illnesses, cancers and things, and a rise in suicides, commonly called deaths of despair. The fifth giant is precarity. And precarity is not the same as insecurity. It's vitally important. In my books on the precariat, I've argued that it is a mistake to focus on casual labor as the defining features of being in the precariat. The defining feature is you feel like a supplicant. You feel you don't have rights, you are losing rights. You are a denizen, not a citizen. You're losing social rights, economic rights, political rights, cultural rights. That is what it's like being in the precariat. Basic income wouldn't cure precarity, but it would reduce the feeling of being a supplicant where you have to ask for favors from bureaucrats, landlords, employers, parents, whatever it might be. You have a right. That's vital. The sixth giant are those robots. Now, at the moment, the left seems to be stymied by the fear of automation and robots. We should be welcoming technological change, but at the moment, we are so treating jobs as fetish rather than the income distribution as the thing to be tackling. I feel it would be great to automate toilet cleaning and road repairs and so on. But we need to recycle the income and rental income being gained by those who are commanding the property of technology. Technology is disruptive, but we need to adjust to it. Now, the seventh giant, and I'm coming to the end, you'll be glad to know, the seventh giant is the biggest of all, and is the one that I think will tip the world in favor of a basic income as the anchor of a new income distribution system. Not a panacea, but an anchor. And that is the threat of extinction. We all know we're rushing towards the destruction of nature. We're rushing towards the destruction of the capability of living with nature as being an integral part of nature, and nature is getting its revenge. We are rushing towards the extinction of the human species as well as the multiple species that we see disappearing all over the world. A basic income needs to be funded by high carbon taxes, high eco taxes, high taxes on those who are taking our commons. We need to think of tax reform to shift towards those bads rather than more taxes on incomes and production. And in doing so, we know that carbon taxes are by themselves regressive. In other words, a person who's a low-income person pays a higher proportion of their income if we opt for high carbon taxes. And that makes them potentially unpopular. But if they're tied to recycling the revenue through a commons fund, through that fund to paying for basic income, then they become progressive and they become what we want, which is deterring pollution, greenhouse gas emissions, and so on. And moreover, a basic income would encourage us to slow down. It would encourage us to shift from resource depleting jobs to care work, to voluntary work, to ecological work, to community work. Dare I say it, political work in the Greek sense of schole. It would alter our perspective on how we wish to live. That, I think, is a great virtue of any social policy. And the final giant, which we all know about, is the threat of neo-fascist populism. We saw it with Trump. I predicted Trump in my Precariat book, and we got him. And he hasn't gone away because there will be other Trumps, more clever Trumps than this one. And neo-fascist populism is sweeping the board, aided by big finance, big tech, who are often funding these creeps, who are participating and taking control. Populism will only be defeated if people feel they have a sense of the future in the way they live, and they have basic security and they have freedom. Otherwise, they will listen to the voices and the sirens promising to bring back yesterday. They'll never succeed, but authoritarianism has always played that card. Basic income is needed to confront that giant as the other giants. I will end on this by saying nobody sensibly says a basic income is a panacea. It isn't. It must be one element of a new progressive agenda. We need stronger voice, collective voice. We need stronger commons. We need to revive the commons. But a basic income is an essential element of that. And that is why I hope the millions who are expressing a feeling for it will be supported by people in mainstream politics. Thank you very much for listening.